Coming to you from a cozy little condo high atop Old 4th Ward, Atlanta. Welcome to The Ron Show on America One Radio. Here's your host, Ron Roberts.
All right, so it's a bit of an ugly day weather-wise here in Atlanta. There is actually a special election primaries happening in Cobb County to fill 2 county commission vacancies, and there's something of a story in and of that. And I know you're thinking, if you're listening not in Metro Atlanta or not in Cobb County, why does this matter? Well, to be honest with you, here we are feeling like we're struggling to keep democracy somewhat within grasp. And in little Cobb County, Georgia, I say little, it's actually a heavily populated county, Cobb County, just north of Atlanta, Georgia, just this one county, we saw where Republican state-level legislators gerrymandered a county map, drew a commissioner out of her district, and then fought through the courts to have her unseated in the midst of her term. That actually happened. And so a county that is a majority Democratic voted county, I know this because I've seen Stacey Abrams win that county twice. Hillary Clinton won that county in 2016. Joe Biden won it in 2020. Kamala Harris carried it last November. It's a Democratically majority county. And yet, thanks to gerrymandering, the county school board is majority Republican. The county commission is now a 50-50 split, and 2 of the 4 seats on the 5 commission seat board are up for grabs. Primary elections happening today. The weather absolutely sucks for that. It is what it is. There have been about 3,000 early votes. And if you care about the partisan divide, when you look at the 3,300 or so early votes, all but 400 of them are Democrat. So that's a positive step. But again, this is just a primary election. The general election happens, I believe, in April. But anyone who cares about democracy, if you live in Cobb County within the sound of my voice, or know somebody who does live in Cobb County, nudge them. Get out, get your vote done today. Make sure you choose the right candidate for your primary selection, and then do it again in a couple of months when those seats are on the line. Cobb County is a blue county, should have solid blue representation at the county commission. It should be nothing less than a 3-2 Democratic majority, even despite state-level GOP gerrymandering. Okay, in just a few minutes, I'm going to give you the conversation I had over the weekend with friend of the show, frequent recurring guest, professor and author Dante King, whose new book, Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis, and Trauma, is out. A 10-part docuseries accompanies it as well. You can learn more about that at DanteKing.com. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you now. If a stark conversation on race in this country, whiteness, blackness, anti-blackness, if any of this makes you uncomfortable, this is probably not the podcast episode for you to stick around and listen to. It is what it is. In fact, I'm going to start with a little bit of a conversation that the entire nation's having on the heels of the Super Bowl. And it's not the blowout win by the Philadelphia Eagles over the Kansas City Chiefs. This one social media post in particular, ironically, this guy comes from Atlanta as well. He's an Air Force veteran. He is a marketing coach, entrepreneur. His name is Derek Harper Sr. His post has gone viral and is sort of necessary. The halftime show seen around the world. Kendrick Lamar, right? I have to be honest with you. I'm sitting there, I'm watching the Super Bowl. I'm kind of tuned out because it's an absolute blowout. And upon first glance in watching this halftime show, I thought to myself, wow, this is a very dressed down performance. You don't see a whole lot of flash, panache. You don't get the pyrotechnics. It felt a lot more like the halftime show done by The Weeknd during the pandemic Super Bowl a couple of years ago, because it was just a lot of dancers spaced out and social distancing. Remember that? It was a good halftime show, I guess, if you like The Weeknd, and I like his music. Never really thought he was the kind of halftime performer that was mainstream enough and had enough pop appeal to make him really leap off the field, but it was passable. And as I'm watching the halftime show, being a former radio guy and heavily involved in the music industry back then, I'm watching this with some interest, thinking, is he going to do the Drake line from They Not Like Us? And at that point, upon first watch, I'm missing what's actually being put on display. And even I, needed explanation. I needed to see it again. I needed to have it sort of explained to me. And we as a nation are having it explained to us. Derek Harper did a pretty good job of this. His Facebook post, which I shared at Ron Show ATL on Facebook as well. You can follow along and read if you'd like. He writes, "Let me dissect the Super Bowl performance scene by scene for those who don't understand why it was impactful." He writes, "One of the biggest revolutions in Super Bowl history happened on the stage tonight, and folks screaming it's boring or trash because it went over their head. I admit it did for me. This is what you didn't see," Derek writes. Then again, the message is blacks have always been here to entertain they, who are not like us, he writes, so they aren't bored. They rather have Wayne, I guess Lil Wayne up there, high, who is backed Drake, the system, to push the agenda, he writes. The message Kendrick just sent to America could not use Wayne. It even started with the American flag being built out of black people, as America being built on the backs of black people, Derek writes. And then there's the photo. You see that. Before I mention how being cool in our culture has always been stolen, no matter how many people try to steal it, they not like us, Derek writes. In all caps, he goes, it was not about white people. It was about the people who control the media and labels who create divide. Okay, here goes. In this post, he talks a lot about the lyrics and song titles used, etc., and so on. He goes into Uncle Sam, Ewell L. Jackson, started it off with the rules of the game of historical white America. Uncle Sam equals the U.S. of A. United group. They not like us, he says. Then said, when a bunch of blacks hanging out on the corner under the streetlight is too deep for the culture. Derek writes, somebody gotta die. Deduct a life and create an environment to cancel each other out. Can't have black men getting along with each other. They'll build. So anywhere that happens, let's make it dangerous. Set curfews, have police harass to discourage it. The Squid Games start. I missed this. Then again, I don't play video games. The Squid Games starts, which symbolizes the rich killing the poor for entertainment. Derek writes, imagine rappers beefing and killing and the media benefiting from their deaths. The dancers in red, white, and blue representing the American flag. Been dancing to the drums of the system. And we want entertainment and to be able to dance rather than be educated, Derek writes. The main stage was a PlayStation Squid Games card. And the system is a game designed to keep us dancing and in prison, which is why it was in a prison yard, Derek writes. This all went completely over my head. Protecting black women like Serena Williams after the disrespect from Drake. The system allows Drake to push the sexy red to taint the culture and empowers him, but hurts the value of the black woman. This is some deep stuff, and it's just so funny that I had this interview lined up for today's show with Dante King, fresh on the heels of him releasing this new book, Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, that he and I had this conversation prior to the Kendrick Lamar halftime show, and yet it just dovetails so perfectly into the conversation that you'll hear he and I had. Back to Derek Harper. Notice he brought out SZA as a black woman, and she did not have to be half naked on display for the world, letting her voice shine. Okay, America, Derek writes. He was showing patriotism. How about instead of wanting to leave the country, we have the same patriotism and treat it like it's ours? Derek Harper writes, we did build it. Why not celebrate what you built? Now let's kill the system that has all of us fighting, and instead of loving and uniting to see what's being done, take pride in what we built. It's ours too, Derek Harper writes. He continues, I mean, the system knew if they could get you hating it, you won't stand for it, creating more division from those who stand for it. Uncle Sam, he writes, created the rules to play by. And now it's time for us to change the rules. This revolution will be televised, he writes. And once again reminding the system of Drake and America, quote, they are not like us and can't infiltrate the culture. Derek writes, game over, TV off, been under their control, revolution. He goes on to write, Kendrick loves America, which is why he refers to Drake as Canadian and doesn't look at this as a black thing. He feels he infiltrated the culture and tried to make a mockery of what black culture is, hence the Atlanta verse they didn't get to in Not Like Us. Derek writes, this is bigger than rap, and women who feel disrespected should see it. People who are tired of being divided should see it. Notice the American flag divided. But most of all, those who didn't have a lens to see it just shows the system has worked, and you're the type it's been working on. There's a lot more to this post that, again, you can read and follow along and dissect that halftime show. Again, if you feel the need to, I, again, have that at Ron Show ATL. I'll also put it in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. In the meanwhile, Dante King, author of the book, again, fresh out. And yes, it's on Amazon, but I'm going to ask him if there's a black bookseller that we can also order this from. I think he mentioned Marcus Books. I'll check on that and remind you. I'll have that as well in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. The book is called Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis, and Trauma. And by the way, it does come with a 10-part docuseries as well. Information at DanteKing.com. I'll have all of this in the show notes at ronshowatl.com. Dante King joins us next on The Ron Show, America One Radio, Progressive Voices via TuneIn. By the way, you can call The Ron Show. You may not get me live, but you can always leave a voicemail if you have thoughts or comments. 404-919-2725. Great to have returning show guest Dante King on. Dante has a new book out, and it's already showing up on Amazon charts. It's called Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis, and Trauma in America. Dante, we got to talk about these book titles, man. They're so long. Your book titles are just so long. Well, it doesn't seem to be hurting when it comes to showing up on Amazon charts. Congratulations on that. And there's a 10-part docuseries that's sort of an accompaniment, correct?
Yes. Thank you so much for highlighting both.
So, first of all, I have to ask you, when one needs to have their whiteness diagnosed, I'm pretty white. But for those who may not know, can you sort of explain what whiteness is before I self-diagnose whiteness?
Sure. So, if we look at it from a historical standpoint, it's a concept that was developed to locate all European ethnic groups into a category that would separate them for people who were considered non-European by phenotype. Mm-hmm. And so so much of it was centered around complexion and color, mm-hmm. which when you go back to colonial level law, you start to see those words used in the law. For example, in 1705, there is a law that states that no white person, no white servant would be legally authorized to work on a plantation where someone of a different complexion might be in a role of authority. Wow. And then and then in 1740, so that law was Virginia. In 1740, there is a law in South Carolina, the 1740 South Carolina Negro Act, that specifically stipulates that by visual observation, Black people, if they are interpreted to be Black, they would be enslaved. But anyone who is not interpreted as having any Black or African blood, they would be exempted. So, for example, Indians, it states if they follow the Indian color, they would be exempted. And so it's very clear that the goal of white European people is to establish a color caste system based on colorism and complexion and phenotype. And so, but if we are to understand that whiteness is not biological, it is not scientific, and there's never been a legal definition established to define what whiteness is. We're talking about people's own self-concept and interpretation of themselves, but also the application of a color to replace ethnic identity or national origin.
The whole time you're talking, I'm picturing the Family Guy meme. You know the one I'm talking about, where he's holding up the card with the various skin colors?
Yes.
You've seen the meme, right? I mean, that's the whole time I'm thinking, I'm like, white enough, not white enough, not white enough. And it just carries on. But you bring up some past laws, and even though those are archaic laws now by modern norms, laws that were on the books a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries ago do still carry stigmas that last in today. And I get the sense that this is sort of what your book is trying to dive into a little bit, to show where past ills still continue to provide repercussions for us in modern society today. Am I right or wrong? Am I somewhere in the ballpark there?
You're absolutely right, because we have to understand the political reason why these terms were established. Whiteness across many different European cultures represented something that was close to God. It represented purity, angelic, something that was angelic, and goodness. Black, on the other hand, in many European cultures, represented baseness, evil, the devil. There are books like White Over Black by Winthrop Jordan that goes through a lot of that history, unveiling how these colors were fixtures across different cultures. So when we get to America, particularly in the colonial period, but also at the founding of the United States of America, we have to then realize that that word white is used in the first law that establishes citizenship in the United States. And it is specifically because people, by that time it's baked in, people see themselves as being close to God, as being sovereign, as being pure, as being good people. And blackness as a political function was used to subjugate and to locate people across different African ethnic identities into a category that would forever debase them. And so the psychological association that we have in this country, that we have in this culture, is one of inadequacy or negativity and scrutiny when it comes to how we interpret, perceive, and or relate to what it means to be Black or Blackness.
I want to expound on that a little bit, because I think even deviating from words white and black or whiteness and blackness, there are other terms and buzzwords that carry a negative connotation. I live in downtown Atlanta. The word downtown now carries with it a negative connotation after decades of evisceration after the white flight movement of the mid and late 20th century. The term urban has a negative connotation for the same reasons. It's affixed to Black music and television and the arts. And again, it carries with it a certain stigma. And we've seen in recent years, even having a conversation about critical race theory, terms like Black Lives Matter, the word woke became stigmatized instantly, weaponized in political subsets. And so this sort of proliferates and carries on. My question to you is, this is a pretty heady subject in a book that covers a lot of heady subjects on the intersectionality and the bisectionality, I guess, in some respects, of the American culture. How do you prescribe anyone who wants to have such a heady conversation with those who have minds that are completely made up? Listen, I'm a child of the South. I'm as white as they get. I sunburn before I tan. I grew up in the suburbs. How do you broach these conversations with folks whose minds are completely locked down, closed? They don't want to hear it. They don't want to have this conversation, and come to some realizations that may not be comfortable for them. Is there a way to do this that doesn't come off as like an attack?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been engaged in, at least for the last 10 years, a program. It's a 16-week long fellowship where I bring people from different racial identities together, different backgrounds, and we explore kind of the development of the history of this country through laws and policies at the local, state, and federal level. We start during the 17th century, looking at laws that were implemented throughout different colonies, but we progress through the 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, just going decade by decade, examining how these racial classifications have functioned to both enfranchise and disenfranchise people from different racial backgrounds. And I think when we examine historically the attitudes of white people and how those attitudes developed based on both a psychological attachment to whiteness and an emotional attachment to whiteness, we are then to understand that people are operating out of their impressions, but it's more so hallucinatory than it is real. And so we have to also understand that this attachment to whiteness functions politically, because if I'm able to ascribe a certain definition, worth, or value, and I'm able to also control the cultural and institutional functions in terms of how people develop and evolve and make associations to what it means to be white, then you're right. When I use other buzzwords such as, oh, wow, that's a good neighborhood over there, the automatic assumption is that mostly white people live or inhabit that neighborhood. Or if that's a good school, the same thing. And if it's an urban neighborhood, to the point that you just made, or a bad neighborhood or a bad school, the automatic association psychologically is that it's got to be a place where mostly non-white people reside or go to school, and particularly Black people.
No, you're 1,000%. Listen, I'm a residential realtor, a real estate agent, and they coach us through code of ethics training sessions every few years and remind us that we can't even engage in conversations about demographics, demography, or even the school conversation. We can't have the conversation about schools for that very reason. Because fair housing practices were developed to combat those sort of dog whistle questions and tropes that come from using terms like that.
Right. And if I may add, I think the part of my research that really grabbed me and kind of choked me up were all of these different scientific philosophies that were developed through Ivy League institutions predominantly to create justifications for why Black people were inferior. And so some stated that, we had lower lung capacity or that we had less bumps on the skull. And so therefore we needed masters. But at the same time, it's positioning white people as kind of this sovereign prototype of a human being. And that they are establishing that they are superior in every way. But those scientific justifications were used by, for example, the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1927 Buck v. Bell ruling. And then in the 1926 rulings, Corrigan v. Buckley and Euclid v. Ambler, which established that racial segregation in both zoning as well as racial restrictive covenants. They use science, and they said because Black people are inferior, they carry different diseases, they are intellectually and morally incapable of developing fully, that we don't want white children to go to school with them. We don't want white children to live or be influenced by Black children, so therefore we have to put them in slums and ghettos. And to understand how that worked, and again, based on a false impression or a false reality that, we are somehow different morally and developmentally, that has huge ramifications, and we feel them even up until this day.
Want to be on the show? Have a cause or campaign you'd like to speak up for? Email Ron at ronshowatl.com or call 404-919-2725. The Ron Show on America One Radio.
We're with author Dante King, new book, Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis, and Trauma in America. We're not even talking about ancient history here. We're not talking just about Supreme Court rulings in the 1920s, although the ones that you cite, I wasn't taught about in K through 12, or even in some of my early college years, now that I think about it. And so I'm a little peeved about that. But we're seeing some of this thought process play out. I mean, we literally just had Senate confirmation hearings where Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was questioned about vaccine efficacy between Black patients and white patients. I mean, this isn't ancient stuff that we're talking. This is still happening today.
That's right. And so I classify or characterize what you just, the example that you just gave, as there's this attempt to either superhumanize Black people or dehumanize us. We're either not good enough or like we're just very strong and resilient. And both of those orientations are dangerous. They're extremely dangerous.
Yes,
we're not superhuman. or subhuman. We're human. And so when we heard RFK Jr. make the assertion that Black people should be put on a different vaccine schedule because we don't need as many antigens, that reminded me of, people like or Charles Davenport, who's known as one of the fathers of the eugenics movement. The science of physiognomy, that said that you could just look at Black people and tell that they are inferior. Diaesthesia Ethiopica, that was developed by Dr. Samuel Cartwright, where he defined scientifically that Black people were dishonest, lazy. So it's to your point, it's right out of the same playbook.
But let me push this a little bit further too. We also saw, I think, a full display, if you ask me, of whiteness in the immediate reaction to the deadly plane crash with the helicopter over the Potomac River, and the immediate assertion from, I will call him what he is, the white nationalist in chief, who is President of the United States. I digress. Anyway, it really angered me that without any evidence whatsoever that he immediately cited diversity, equity, and inclusion as a rationalization for something like that to have occurred, without knowing the racial makeup of the cockpit, without knowing the racial makeup of the helicopter crew. I believe that you had 3 white folks in that helicopter. One of them was a woman. So let's also remind white women, when they say DEI, they're talking about you too, ladies. But this otherism, that standards are lowered because of the need for bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion into the conversation when it comes to fulfilling jobs or slots in schools. Even that is an insult.
Well, it is, but what it highlights, at least for me, and this is what I write about in my book, this obsessive addiction and an attachment to this presumption of superiority.
Yes.
that has sat with white men predominantly, and it's been sanctioned in the white mind. So even as we're hearing many of these white men say things like, we need to go back to merit-based, well, the presumption is that they are the most capable and qualified.
Right.
So if they're using merit, then it justifies why they should be in every role of authority, or of significance in high influence. And I think we saw here recently, Donald Trump selected someone to work at the State Department who put on, I believe it was X, formerly known as Twitter, that the reason why American institutions are failing is because competent white men are not at the head of every institution. Well, it wasn't stated that exactly that way, but that was the sentiment.
Yep. So again, this book, I feel, to me, can be intimidating to those who might be afraid to even crack it open or have this conversation. What is the secret? You've obviously had these conversations with folks who may have been timid to even have this conversation, or maybe even had a closed mind. What is the secret? How do you unlock these minds? How do you broach this conversation in a way that actually moves the needle?
Well, what I also want to say, too, is that this was a personal exploration for me as a Black man.
Okay, good.
And because some of the discoveries that I had to reflect on as been going through my journey for the last 15 years is, we've never been Black on our own terms, without the authority, without the influence, and the existence of white racial control. We've never been Black on our own terms without being in an oppressive state. And so what then does it even mean to be Black, right? And so I'm searching for trying to figure out those answers and reimagine, what the reality would be for me as a Black person, for people in my family, and for the larger community, in terms of highlighting, what would my mindset be? What who would I be, or could I be, without being seen as a part of a group that is oppressed here in America? So it's more of a work of reflection more than anything. I'm not writing my thoughts, or I didn't write this book to attack anyone. I wrote the book, though, to make some things plain, because there are so many times there can be conversations about racism, which I believe is a very ambiguous word, but we're not highlighting the narcissism that is contained within, white people's preoccupation with race. We're not highlighting, for example, what we're seeing with Donald Trump and some of the people that he has selected to be a part of his cabinet who would be defined in clinical terms as malignant narcissists and or psychopaths. And I really appreciate conservative lawyer George Conway, who has been using this language recently. And I think it's not only is it effective, I think it's necessary so that we can pinpoint in a very nuanced fashion what we are experiencing and seeing before our eyes in this very moment.
Here's what I love about that response to my question. I was making it about white people needing to have this conversation, and you're like, no. That's all fine and well, and I appreciate that, but it's not just about white people. Obviously, you literally just kind of said, well, I actually kind of wrote this, for me too, and for anyone else who's black and wants to have that sort of introspection themselves. I think that's a useful tool. I also can't help but think about those in the African American community who have sort of resorted to rejecting being black or their own blackness in deference to kowtowing to what seems to be a bit of a bump in this white nationalist, America first, I don't see any race sort of mentality that exists right now.
That's right. So to that, the point that you just made, and to where I was going a moment ago, we as black people have been socialized and are trained to be anti-black. We're also trained with the same value set as white people, as Asian people, as Hispanic, Latin people who exist in this culture. Our striving, all of our progress models, all of our measures for progress, are in American culture, that means to become more like white people or as close to white people as you can get, whether it be our language orientation, whether it be our education, whether it be the way that we present ourselves, all of it, our thought process. And so by aligning with white supremacy and really deeply analyzing and synthesizing the experiences that we've had here as a group, we also have to understand, Dr. Joy DeGruy, she wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. But I say that we are all suffering from white people derangement syndrome. Because again, I don't know a reality without the presence and the influence of Eurocentricity. I've never been black on my own terms. I've never been black without the reality of white racial control. And so and James Baldwin said this some decades ago, but we have been programmed as black people to detest and inherently really be against what it means to be anti-black, which is why I wrote this, because these are psychological orientations. And if you compel a group of people if you create a cultural orientation where you state in society that one group of people, not only are they inferior, but the way that they look is detestable, that they are worthy of degradation, and you create rationales for that to happen, then the group, the people who are located within the group, the targeted group, will then begin to learn to hate themselves. And that's where we are in this society. There are so many black people, including myself, that have been programmed to be anti-black. And that's why I had to write this, because I go, wow, this is not just an issue for white people, but everyone in this society. I can look around and observe how they have been trained and programmed to be anti-black. And if you go and you spark a conversation just for 30 minutes with any random person and you bring up black people, you will hear some of the most negative and derogatory terms within that 30-minute window. I can almost guarantee it.
That's pretty sober. That is a sober thought. I sat here a moment ago and was thinking a little bit about, even my having a conversation with someone like you about a book like this. I get accused a lot of times, especially in conservative culture, of trying to play the white savior, having a white savior complex, and that sort of hurts my heart, because I feel like just by having an open mind, I'm being dismissed for fostering a conversation that we all need to have. And
that's right.
And the fact that you, in writing this book, even reveal within yourself that it's a conversation you needed to have with yourself to understand that, you even if you as a black man can have some inherent traumas or some anti-black triggers in your mind, then we all do. And
yes.
And that has to be something that we work on. And listen, I hear the anti-white jokes. Some of the best comedians out there crack white jokes, and some I get humor, but in just about every joke, there's a little bit of truth too. So it just kind of hurt my heart when I heard you say that a little bit about how, in your process of writing this book, you realized that you had some embedded, deeply seated anti-black embeds even in your mindset. And I think that's, again, just a sobering discovery, self-discovery, and one that I'm thankful that you shared with us, but also one that I think we can learn from outside the black bubble, that that's something that definitely exists within the rest of us to work on as well. And it's a daily progress, and it's like exercising. You're not going to get a better run time unless you get up and run every day. And it's, to me, the same sort of mental exercise as well, to work on, opening your mind to others, whether it be African Americans, whether it be, our Hispanic brothers and sisters who are, here legally, illegally, trying to be here through legal means, et cetera, and so on. This is an exercise that we have to get up and put our sneakers on and go take the jog every day.
Absolutely. And I also want to take what your summary of what I said a step further.
Okay.
Not only was I able to uncover and realize my own anti-blackness, but I was able to see anti-blackness in every black person that I know. And every black person that I come across. And if you were to spend a week with me, I would begin to just point it out to you, certain comments that are stated, certain expectations that people have of black people. And if you grow up in a black family, anyone black listening to this will understand what I'm about to say. We are held to such high standards because we are trained as children to make sure that we maintain white comfort and that we don't ever disrupt it. That means calling people sir and ma'am, smiling, making sure we make eye contact, speak, come across friendly. And when we get into like the education or the professional fold, we adhere to and are trained to exhibit the same white standards of professionalism, of what it means to take initiative and learn. All of these variables, our experience here as predominantly African people is one of forced assimilation. We're trying to fit into a scenario that was not intended for us, but we've never been accepted into it either. And so we are navigating an identity crisis. White people are navigating their own identity crisis, as are other Americans, which if you access, for example, Dr. Claire Jean Kim's book, her book is titled Asian Americans Living in Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World. Tanya Katari Hernandez, who is a law professor, who is an Afro-Latina, she wrote a book called Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. These are psychological orientations that have been established, that are long-standing, and they are fixtures within our culture. And so I had to take to task the way in which anti-blackness, yes, this was handed to us by Europeans, by white people, but as black people, we've ingested the diet and we perpetuate it. So even those individuals who might suggest that you play white savior, I can guarantee you that every single one of them has participated and continues to participate in enacting anti-blackness. So for me, this is not about phenotype. This is about developing a collective consciousness whereby we can be honest with each other and start really addressing some of the ills of our society that have been long-standing and that are still persisting to this day.
Listen, I'm going to suggest everybody go out and buy this book. If you're not buy it for yourself, buy an extra copy for your nearby library or your church library or your reading group. I mean, obviously, this is something that will provoke some conversations that may even be uncomfortable within your friend group or family. It's called Diagnosing Whiteness and Anti-Blackness, White Psychopathology, Collective Psychosis and Trauma in America. Dante King, the author. Also, the docuseries as well. We can learn more about this by going to DanteKing.com. By the way, I'll put that in the show notes at RonShowyTL.com. But Dante, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm a little old school. I grew up a latchkey kid, and I watched a lot of reruns of sitcoms on TBS back in the day. And I feel like, man, if we all just sat down and watched a few seasons, and I'm not kidding with you here. This is not me being, snide, or I feel like if we sat down and watched a few episodes of Sanford and Son from back in the day, like these uncomfortable conversations were actually being had on network television, very unfiltered by today's standards back in the 1970s.
That's right. I absolutely agree with you. Sanford and Son is one of them. I think even, and I hate to mention this, even though when I was growing up, it was one of my favorite shows. But even shows like Good Times.
I knew you were going to say Good Times. Yes, and the Jeffersons. Oh my God.
Or the Jeffersons. But I want to say this though. All of those depictions of black characters that you see, most of those shows had white writers.
Yes.
So even what you're looking at on TV in terms of how you are assessing or what's informing you about how black people are, that came from a white perspective.
Yes. Yes, 1,000%. Man, all right, listen, I'm going to order the book. I'm going to ask everybody. Can I get it somewhere other than Amazon? I'm trying to have a Bezos diet right now after all this stuff that's happened. For sure. Because
it's on Barnes & Noble and every other major global book retailer that you can access online. I
was going to ask you that. Now, is there a black-owned book retailer that folks can purchase it from? It is Black History Month after all, so let's see if we can't, share the wealth a little bit.
Yes, reach out to Marcus Books. It's the longest Black-owned book retailer in the United States, and they are located in Berkeley, California. But if you reach out to them or go to their website or call, they will order the book.
Awesome, Dante King. Thank you so much for making this time and joining me to have this thought-provoking and, listen, I'm not gonna lie, uncomfortable conversation on whiteness and anti-blackness. I do appreciate that, and look forward to getting your book.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate you.
Just a few more minutes for today's Ron Show, and I want to focus a little bit on one big target for the Trump administration: the elimination of the Department of Education. It's a very real thing, and it's the Trump voting states that have more to lose if the Department of Education is to go away, if the DOE is dismantled. And April Rubin with Axios writes a good bit about that. States that voted for Trump last November, on average, used more federal funding in their education apportions than states that voted for former Vice President Harris. This quote from Kevin Weiner, the director of the National Education Policy Center. That dependence is in large part because they're just lower wealth states and they don't have the same capacity to step in and make up that difference. At 23%, Mississippi had the highest proportion of federal public school funding that school year, while South Dakota and Arkansas followed with 22% each, according to USA Facts. New York at 7% had the lowest. Mississippi spends on average $12,390 on public K-12 spending per student, compared to New York's $33,440, according to the Education Data Initiative. Anywhere from 11 to 14% of public school funding is federal, according to Weiner. That figure was on the higher end after the start of the pandemic, but has since decreased. Now, the states that receive the most funding include states like Kentucky, Arkansas, Mississippi, Montana, South Dakota, Alaska. And then the entirety of the former Confederacy can be lumped in there, save for Virginia. Throw in West Virginia if you'd like. Tennessee, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri. Remember those states, because these are also some of the states that have school voucher programs. South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia about to, Florida, Arkansas, Oklahoma, along with Montana, states like Arizona, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio, West Virginia. You're hearing all Trump states, right? These are all states that are high on the list of states that receive federal funding from the Department of Education to educate K through 12, but also states now that have school vouchers so that tax dollars go to private school tuitions. Of course, under the guise that the poorer students in those states would have access to a scholarship that could, in theory, pay for at least a portion of the tuition. But if you can only pay for a portion of a poor child's tuition and public schools still remains, even though it'll be a lesser option without that federal funding, the parent or parents of that child that cannot afford one dime out of pocket for a private school tab is just not going to be able to make use of that voucher. So who does? The student already going. The student whose parents can already afford the private school tab. This is just an opportunity to diminish and lessen public education in the most vulnerable parts of the country for the most vulnerable students in the more impoverished families in those at-risk states. Teacher layoffs, bigger classroom sizes, less attention for the most vulnerable students, which, by the way, include the physically and or mentally disabled or disadvantaged. You know, I'm chuckling because right now MAGA is sharing a New York Post article about $59 million that DOJ found for luxury hotels for immigrants in New York City. And who sent the immigrants there in the first place? Texas Governor Greg Abbott, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, to a city with the most expensive hotel tabs on average in the country. I just provide that as one example where they're literally the kid who puts the stick in the wheel spoke on the bike they're trying to ride and then complains about everybody else causing them to crash the bike. They're about to do the very same thing to the Department of Education. And as I mentioned before, this just leads us back to an era where the Daughters of the Confederacy are handling the history textbook curriculum so that we can have a further whitewashing of our nation's history. Something Kendrick Lamar was trying to help us understand better. That's going to do it for today's Ron Show. I want to thank Dante King for joining us. Show notes at ronshowatl.com. Back here tomorrow, 9 a.m., 5 p.m. on America One Radio, 11 p.m. Progressive Voices via TuneIn or wherever you podcast. Take care.